All right, welcome back. I want to talk about some of the clients you're working with right now, or most recent clients to actually get a deal across the finish line. And let's just unpack a little bit about how that went for them. What kind of business were they buying? What was the scenario? Just so someone at home here watching these videos can kind of see it full circle.
Sure. Yeah, I'll kind of jump in and get started because I'm usually kind of the one that's the face of our organization in terms of getting the deal from LOI to closing, and then working specifically with Andrew around transition, specifically with Brittany and the rest of the financials team around transition and around financial DD. We had, I think, one thing that comes to mind. Everybody loves to hear the war stories, right? Of things. We had it was a construction related business recently. And we had some challenges around the inventory system because the seller didn't have any tracking of the inventory, but they wanted to get credit for the inventory at closing. So we had to jump in, and Brittany actually worked really closely with them on this to come out and figure out what are they going to do. And even that, we had a few surprises post closing. But Brittany, you want to tell us a little bit about that deal?
Yeah, so let's talk about that one. That one was a really interesting one. We had a situation where the owner was the seller was really anxious to close the deal. The buyer was really anxious to close the deal. The seller sent in one of his less experienced people to do the inventory count, and it turned out that at the end of the day, he might have maybe miscounted some things. So for example, like I said, we have 150 of these things, and the office manager later after close said, well, no, we've never actually ever carried more than 20 or 30 or whatever. And then there was maybe some things that were very obsolete, like 20 or 30 years old, that had been included in the valuation that shouldn't have been. So post-close, we've had the office manager and one of the more experienced team members looking at that, working through that to validate what's there so that we can find that adjustment. We can put a dollar amount on that adjustment and help recoup that for the buyer. Fortunately, where David was involved in the legals on this particular deal, he did put that clause in there, and he can speak a little bit more about that, which provides a sort of a safety net, if you will, to allow them to get.
Yeah, and I think that's one of the keys of working with a group like us, where we have an integrated team of financial and legal and operational. Is the legal team, we're putting provisions in the contract to protect the buyer. So we have, in this case, what's called a clawback provision. If there's anything that the seller represented, in this case, they made a representation that there was X amount of inventory on the books. If that number isn't there and we can document that, the financial team's job is to do the documenting of it. We have the ability to recoup that money by offsetting against the seller note. And that's one of the reasons you also want seller notes in all your deals. I know Carl tells us he never, ever, 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 I think he does like 17 evers, buys a deal without some level of seller note. And that's part of the reason is a seller note will give you that capacity to recoup that without having to chase the seller down. If there's not a seller note, then we're going to want to put in some sort of escrow provision where the seller doesn't get all of their money at closing. It gets set aside and held back so we can cover that. Another deal real quickly that we had recently that I was involved in directly, the landlord was just incorrigible. We at one point the buyers met with the landlord's representative, and he literally said, "Oh, so you've got a deal with you and the seller have made a deal, and you now want to take over the lease?" Yep, we do. Well, how's your financing? Yeah, we've got all the financing lined up. We've got a commitment. We just need to get the lender requires the lease to match the term of the loan, so we need a 10-year lease from you. The seller literally looked across the table at our client and said, I could kill this deal if I wanted to. I've done it before.
The seller or the landlord?
I'm sorry, the landlord.
The landlord.
Landlord.
Oh.
Yeah, so I could kill this deal before. Turns out, as we dug a little bit more into it, our client dug into it, turns out there's been a little kind of a love-hate relationship between the seller and the landlord, and he was really punishing the seller, but it came across as punishing our client. So we went through all kinds of scenarios with them, and this is where it pays to have experienced M&A counsel and experienced counsel in general, because I was able to provide a lot of different scenarios that they could put in front of the landlord that both demonstrated that we were sophisticated buyers and we understood how transactions work. And every time they would put up a roadblock of, you can't do this because of X, we would come back to them and say, well, okay, if that's your objection, we'll solve that with Y. So for example, they insisted on the seller continuing to guarantee the lease post-close. So we then went and sat down with the seller and with the buyer and said, okay, then the buyer will guarantee your guarantee. The seller said, well, but if everything goes south, you're not going to have any money. So, okay, fine. The buyer was going to get a credit line to support the business anyway. So we were able to use a chunk of the credit facility. They were going to get, I think, a $500,000 credit facility. We carved out $100,000 of that and had the bank issue a letter of credit to the sellers to guarantee that the sellers were guaranteeing on the lease.
Wow.
And so it's a matter of knowing the tricks and knowing the resources that are available. Our client didn't even know what a letter of credit was and had no idea there was a way to get a financial backstop on a transaction like that.
And I think there was one recently that we had. So with all of the planning that we put into it with the sellers and the buyers, things happen. We had one recently where the cat was going to be let out of the bag, right? Because we find a lot of the buyers and sellers want to keep it secret, obviously, for confidentiality and things like that. But as we're talking and having conversations with the seller, they were going to go over to a conference, and unfortunately, the cat was going to end up out of the bag because the individual that was going is the new owner. So why would that person be there? So one of the conversations we had very quickly around it was, how do we communicate this now? Now, we don't have a deal done. It's not in place, but we're going to have to communicate this to the team. So we quickly rallied the troops around and formulated the communication, not only just to the team, but now to the seller, to the vendors and the customers out there. So we actually rallied around, figured out the right communications that we had, how to position it, when people are coming, when people are going to be attending, and having those conversations. And what turned out to be, a monumental panic turned out to be a very successful communication. And everybody, I think we got some of the commentary back. Great, because we're actually wondering when you were going to do this, right? When they were going to retire. And everybody's now confident that the business is moving forward and their jobs are safe. So just having a team around you that understands elements like that is really, really powerful.
Yeah, and conversely, the same deal that we had with the inventory, the opposite happened, right? Because there is a flurry of activity in the week before the closing. You're pulling reports. Why are we recounting inventory for the third time this month? We haven't counted it in 3 years,
or ever.
So many, or ever, exactly. Or do we even know how to count? But so much activity is going on in the week of the closing. It's really hard to keep the lid on things, and that happened in that transaction, where the day before the closing, several of the key employees walked into the owner's office and said, something's going on here and we don't understand what is up. Mm-hmm. So it's really important to plan for those things. Frankly, I think it's a horrible idea to keep it a secret till closing. I wish all sellers would realize that there's a point. We were talking to someone in the protege community, and they made a great analogy, and we'll wrap with this. The other day said, look, when you're selling your house, you don't wait till you go to the title company and sign the paperwork on the deed and then go home and start to pack. Once there's a point, when you first sign the contract, you may not start to pack either. But once you find out, okay, the title commitment has come back and it's clear, and the survey has come back and it's fine, and we've got an indication from the lender that the mortgage is approved, the seller has a good credit, or the buyer has a good credit score, things are starting to fall in place. The dominoes are falling, and we begin to pack up the boxes because we know when we close the deal, we're moving out. I think that sellers and buyers need to take that same approach when it comes to the communication strategy. There's a point where this deal is at the point of no return, and we need to implement the transition communication strategy and not surprise them at the last minute. The other thing I hate is when the buyer maybe come to visit the business either A, you have to visit on a Sunday when nobody's there and you can't see the business in operation, or if you come to see the business in operation, you're introduced as an insurance agent, or you're introduced as a consultant, or you're introduced as the fire inspector, and then all of a sudden 3 months later you come back and it turns out you weren't the fire inspector, you're the new owner. It's just I think that breeds so much potential for distrust and risk. So there's a few
But
few
part
more
of
stories.
being an advisor is being able to tell these stories of why it may not make sense to the seller in the moment to not explain this ahead of time, but you can show these analogies and these stories to help people see some of the pitfalls. And it also can punish the new owner, and it's unfair. So I think it's
Right.
huge. So that's part of being an advisor. So thank you so much. And we'll see you in the next video.